The rain was a cold, indifferent curtain, blurring the city lights into abstract smears of neon. "Help me. Please, can you see me?" That's what she tried to say. Juniper Lane, barely 10 years old, a slip of a girl with eyes the color of old coins and a coat too thin for the late November chill, stood stranded. She wasn't weeping. Her face was a mask of fierce, absolute focus, which was far more unsettling than any tears. She stood under the humming, broken neon sign of a 24-hour laundromat, a place where people went to wash their dirt, not look for trouble. She was small, out of place, clutching a worn, child-sized backpack like a life raft. When the lone woman inside, engrossed in a true crime podcast, finally glanced up, Juniper did the only thing she could. She didn't speak. She moved. Her hands flew up, a frantic, graceful ballet of desperation against the grime-streaked glass. She was signing. A flurry of shapes, swift and sharp, utterly incomprehensible to the woman on the other side. A silent, desperate signal being broadcast into a world that couldn't tune in. The woman, Diana, mid-30s, perpetually exhausted, dressed in the uniform of the working poor, finally took off her earbuds. Her brow furrowed, a mix of annoyance at the interruption and vague concern for the waif shivering outside. She knocked on the glass, a sharp tap-tap-tap. Juniper didn't react to the sound. She only signed harder, her small fists twisting the air into shapes that meant danger. "Hurt. Run." Diana finally opened the door, a gust of cold air and street noise spilling in. "Hey, kid. You okay? Where's your mom?" Juniper didn't hear the words. She only saw the mouth moving, the questions echoing silently in the void. Her own signing slowed, replaced by a simple, universal gesture, a shaking, pointed finger aimed at her own ear, then a flat palm. Deaf. The few other people inside, a grizzled, silent man reading a tattered paperback, a pair of bored college students, had all paused their lives to watch the silent exchange. The man, Hank, a retired mechanic whose face looked like a topographic map of bad decisions, rose slowly, sensing a shift from ordinary street weirdness to something darker. He watched as Juniper dropped her complex signs and resorted to primal, mimed pleas. She pantomimed a hard slap across the face, then pointed wildly down the street. It was a crude, terrifying piece of silent theater. Her innocence was in jarring contrast to the grim, fluorescent-lit reality of the laundromat. The cold concrete floor, the smell of bleach and burnt dryer lint, suddenly felt like the setting for a hostage situation. The silence in the room was thick, heavier than the rain outside. Hank, moving with a surprising economy of motion, placed his book down. He didn't speak, he just knelt, his heavy, work-worn hands resting gently on his knees. He looked directly into Juniper's eyes, offering a steady, non-judgmental anchor. He pointed to her backpack. Juniper fumbled with the zipper, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear, and pulled out a single, crumpled piece of paper, a child's drawing. It was rendered in crayon, a vibrant, terrifying mess. On the left, a stick figure that was clearly her, small and vulnerable. On the right, a looming, grotesque figure with jagged, black teeth and disproportionately large fists. Connecting them was a bright slash of violent red, labeled simply, him. There was no subtlety, only raw terror. But the true, stomach-dropping detail was the setting. The large figure wasn't just standing in a house, it was drawn standing next to a makeshift, bolted-down cage, a dog kennel, in what looked like a dark basement. The drawing wasn't a child's nightmare, it was a blueprint of her prison. Juniper then took Hank's hand, placed it on her tiny, shaking chest, and tapped twice, a rapid heartbeat. She pointed back at the drawing, then made the sign for father, a thumb tapping the forehead. The implication was immediate, horrific, and undeniable. The man who was supposed to protect her was her abuser, and this wasn't just a runaway. It was an escape from a calculated, deliberate evil. The drawing was the silent scream they finally understood. Diana recoiled, covering her mouth. Hank's eyes narrowed, the last vestiges of his retired, self-involved life evaporating. "Call the cops," he muttered, his voice gravelly. "No. Wait." He was looking out the window, past the drumming rain. A few car lengths down the street, a beat-up, dark blue pickup truck had just pulled over, its engine idling. Two large, Indistinct shapes were visible through the wet glass. They weren't looking at the laundromat, they were scanning the alleyway just past it, moving too slowly, too methodically for casual passers-by. They were searching. Juniper saw them too. Her breath hitched, and she threw herself behind Hank's legs, her body rigid with terror. She started to sign uncontrollably again, a dizzying, fast pattern of shapes, hiding, he sees, bad, locked, quick. Hank placed a massive hand on her head, a shield. They're looking for her, he told Diana, who was fumbling with her phone. She's not just a runaway. She's got a head start. And they'll know where she was last. The truck's headlights flickered, an almost imperceptible signal, and the vehicle began to creep forward, slowly closing the distance. The threat wasn't a distant memory, it was a pair of headlights getting closer, a deep rumble that Juniper, even without hearing, could feel vibrating through the soles of her shoes. The group, Hank, the former mechanic, Diana, the tired cashier, and even the couple of college kids, now had no choice. They were implicated. They were her protectors. To stand down was to hand her back to the monster in the crayon drawing. The truck stopped directly in front of the laundromat. The passenger door swung open, and the man from the drawing, tall, thick-necked, and radiating a casual, confident menace, stepped out. He didn't look panicked or distraught, he looked angry, like an owner whose property had simply wandered off. He was her father, and the man beside him was his associate, just as large, just as grim. "You seen a girl?" the father bellowed, his voice laced with synthetic sweetness that didn't reach his eyes. "Little thing. She's deaf. Runs away sometimes. Needs her medication." He was already walking toward the door. Hank stepped out of the shadow of the vending machine, placing himself directly between the two men and Juniper, who was now hidden behind the industrial-sized washing machines. "Yeah, I saw a little girl," Hank lied, his voice steady. "Said her dad beat her half to death and kept her in a kennel." The man's fake sweetness dissolved into a snarl. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." It was then that Juniper, despite the paralyzing terror, took her act of courage. She had slipped her hand into her backpack and now, leaning out just enough for her hand to be seen, she didn't sign a plea for help. She signed a demand. Her small hands formed the shape for truth, a straight index finger moving upward from the lips, and then she pointed directly at her father. Then, a lightning-quick series of signs they hadn't seen before: phone, record, police. It was a stunning demonstration of intelligence and pre-planning, a child not just begging to be saved but actively directing her rescue. The college students, on cue, suddenly held up their phones, recording. The father paused, momentarily stunned by his daughter's defiance and the sudden presence of cameras. The confrontation didn't need to be physical, the threat of exposure, the cold, hard proof of his evil being filmed, was the weapon that made the villain blink. He saw the witnesses, saw the phones, and saw the utter lack of surrender in his daughter's small, brave face. He cursed, his eyes darting wildly, and scrambled back into the truck, peeling out into the rainy night. The deafening screech of the truck's tires was the final release of tension. The air in the laundromat was suddenly thinner, easier to breathe. Diana sank against a dryer, her face pale. The police arrived shortly, thanks to the now courageous college kid's call, and the whole terrifying ordeal spilled out onto the police reports and into the glaring white light of the patrol cars. Juniper was safe, wrapped in a borrowed, too large police blanket, clutching her crayon drawing. The father and his accomplice were eventually apprehended a few hours later, miles away, thanks to the license plate captured on the student's video. Justice, in this instance, was swift and cold. But as the officers began the sterile process of custody transfer, the new, complex problem materialized. "She'll be placed in temporary protective custody," the lead officer explained, gesturing to a waiting social worker. "A foster home until we can establish a suitable placement." Juniper watched, her sharp eyes moving from the officer to Hank, then to Diana. She didn't need to hear to understand the shift in the atmosphere. She shook her head, a vehement, silent protest, and signed one simple word directly to Hank: "Stay." The victory was won, but the real battle, the bureaucratic, agonizing fight for stability and love, had just begun. Where would she go now? Her survival instinct had led her to safety, but it was their love, newly forged in danger, that she was demanding now. The social worker, a weary but kind woman named Ms. Evans, allowed Hank and Diana to stay with Juniper for the first 24 hours in the temporary shelter. It was in the silence of that small, sterile room that the most profound shift occurred. Hank, the man who hadn't smiled in years, found himself signing awkward, slow variations of food in safe using a basic ASL app Diana had downloaded. Diana, who thought her heart was too hard for anything but caffeine and worry, found herself laughing as Juniper, relieved and safe, used her hands to tell the story of a mischievous cartoon character. The group didn't disband. The college students sent their video footage in a note of support. Hank and Diana, two strangers from different walks of life, suddenly found themselves sharing a singular, overwhelming purpose. They couldn't let Juniper go into the system. They leased a small, inexpensive apartment near the shelter, pooling their meager resources. They learned ASL together, practicing clumsy signs while Hank fixed a broken lamp and Diana cooked. They learned that Juniper loved bright colors, hated the dark, and communicated complex emotions not just through signs, but through a unique, dramatic tilt of her head or a specific, powerful glare. The most challenging moments were the quiet ones. One afternoon, Hank found her tracing the outlines of the bolts on a chair leg, the memory of the kennel visceral. He didn't try to talk. He simply sat beside her, and gently began to sign "not here." Safe. Juniper looked at the rough lines on his weathered face, then back at his hands, and finally, she signed back home. It wasn't just a place she was looking for, it was a feeling. Diana bought her a cheap, fuzzy pink coat, replacing the thin, soaked one, and taught her the sign for beautiful. They were not related by blood, but they were becoming an unlikely, deeply connected family, bound by the terrible knowledge of what she had escaped and the quiet, fierce determination to keep her world full of color and light. The institutional challenge arrived with the cold efficiency of a court summons. The Department of Child Services was unconvinced. "Mr. Harrison," Ms. Evans explained gently, reviewing Hank's file. "You have a minor criminal record from 20 years ago. You live alone. Ms. Moreno, you work 2 minimum-wage jobs. You are not a married couple. On paper, you are 2 high-risk individuals with no formal experience." The hearing was a sterile, unforgiving environment, all polished wood and moral judgment. The prosecutor painted a picture of 2 well-meaning but ultimately unfit caretakers. Hank, in his worn jacket, and Diana, nervously smoothing her hair, looked exactly like the wrong side of the tracks the system was built to police. They argued passion, not paperwork. Diana described the chilling composure of Juniper's signing, her desperate intelligence. Hank simply laid the crayon drawing on the judge's bench. The court debated the moral dilemma: did love matter more than structure? Did a safe harbor offered by imperfect people outweigh the clinical safety of a certified foster home? The judge called a recess. When the hearing reconvened, he addressed Juniper directly. Through a certified sign language interpreter, the judge asked the final, devastating question: "Juniper, we need to know who you want to stay with. If you could speak, what would you tell me about these 2 people?" Juniper didn't hesitate. She looked at the judge, then at Hank and Diana, and her hands flew. She didn't sign safe or good. She signed a complex, 3-part sequence: "my eyes," then pointed to Diana; "my hands," then pointed to Hank, and finally, closing her hands around an imaginary heart, she signed "my voice." She explained that Diana had been her first eyes, seeing the danger in acting. Hank was her first hands, the strength that protected her. And in their commitment to learning her language, they had become her voice, the way she could finally communicate her fear and her love. Her testimony was not a child's simple choice, it was a profound, philosophical statement on who truly constituted a family. The courtroom held its breath, suspended between the letter of the law and the spirit of the girl. The judge, an elderly man who had seen too much bureaucracy crush too many good intentions, took a long moment to look from the powerful, silent testament of the child to the raw, hopeful faces of the 2 adults. "The court will not separate this child from the people who, at great personal risk, saved her life and learned her language," he announced, his voice firm. "The temporary guardianship of Juniper Lane is granted to Henry Harrison and Diana Moreno, with a mandate for continued monitoring and support. You are to be her family, jointly and without condition." A massive, collective sigh of relief filled the room. Diana wept, burying her face in Hank's shoulder. Hank, who hadn't cried since his own parents died decades ago, felt a warm, unfamiliar moisture on his cheek. It was Juniper who sealed the resolution. She stood, walked over to her two new guardians, and without using a single sign, performed the most beautiful gesture of all. She simply placed one hand on Diana's arm and one on Hank's, and leaned her head back against their joined hands. They were no longer the mismatched mechanic and the tired laundromat worker, they were the protectors, and she was the anchor that had welded them into an unbreakable, unconventional family. The catharsis was complete, the terror had given way to an immense, quiet joy. 3 years later. The neon sign of the laundromat, miraculously, had been fixed. Inside, a poster, bright and professionally designed, was taped to the window, ASL Beginner Class, Saturdays 10 a.m. Juniper, now 13, wasn't just safe, she was thriving. She wore the fuzzy pink coat only on the coldest days, now more comfortable in her crisp school uniform. She was at the top of her class, a formidable debater in her school's sign language club, and possessed a wicked sense of humor that kept Hank and Diana constantly on their toes. Hank, now clean-shaven and wearing a crisp, matching uniform, was the laundromat's official manager, a respected figure. Diana had gone back to school, studying to be a special education assistant. They had bought the laundromat, turning it from a place of desperate concealment into a hub of community, safety, and silent communication. The ASL class, started on a whim by Diana to teach Hank better signs, had grown into a small movement, drawing in local police officers, teachers, and other community members who wanted to hear the voices that had been previously ignored. They called it the Juniper Project. "You saved her," Diana signed to Hank one afternoon, watching Juniper explain a complex physics problem to a bewildered customer, her hands flying with confidence and flair. Hank signed back, not correcting her, but clarifying the deeper truth: "We didn't save her, D. She saved us." The unspoken plea of a small, deaf girl had not only rescued her from darkness but had forced two forgotten souls to open their hearts, transforming a cold, indifferent city corner into a beacon of empathy. The lesson was simple, and it was the core of their new life: the loudest voices in the world are often the ones you have to look for, not listen for.